Hello everyone, welcome back to AppDev channel. In today's video, we will talk about how to do the authentication or how to implement the Spring Security Authentication using MySQL database and the JPA repository technique. Okay, so as part of our authentication techniques that are available in the Spring Security module, in the previous videos, we talked about the in-memory authentication, right? Where we have created a couple of users with a password and with some default role in the Java class itself. So all these users will be picked up and used while the users are trying to hit your microservice. That is how the in-memory authentication works. So along with that in-memory authentication, we have a couple of other techniques like JDBC authentication, LDAP authentication. Okay, JDBC authentication means we have a couple of tables we have to create in a database, exactly like this, the users tables. If you see this documentation, users table, other this table, they will be having the list of users and the list of roles or the permissions the users can have. They will be placed in the authorities table. So we have to maintain some kind of DDL statements, and we have to create those users in those tables. Then we can use the JDBC authentication technique. Then the users whatever there in those tables, right, they will be picked up for authentication. That is how the JDBC authentication works. Okay, but along with that, we also have the LDAP authentication. Similarly, we can connect to the LDAP server. Users and groups or roles from the LDAP server will be picked up for the authentication of the microservices. Okay, similar to that, we have another technique. Okay, that is user details service. Okay, this is also a technique to implement the authentication to secure your microservices using your custom database or custom tables. So suppose for example in user details service, using this technique, what we will do is we will create a database. Okay, we will design a schema to store users, we will design tables to store users, to store roles, to store the association between the users and the particular specific respective roles of those users. All those tables we will create it. Okay, so while coming to Spring Boot, we create a repository to get the data from those tables. We create repository and also the entity as well, and also we create a service. Okay, that service will actually be implementing from this user details service. Okay, we will create an implementation of this user details service, and that service will connect to the repository that connects to the tables or the schema that we are going to create it. So once we get the service that is loaded with the data from our custom schema, Spring Security will take the data from the database that is fetched by using this service, user details service, and it will be used automatically by the Spring Security framework to implement the authentication. Okay, similarly, the way the username and password configured here are being picked up by the security framework to do the authentication of your microservices, right? Similarly, the users will be picked up from the service. For that service, we have to give the data from the database by through a repository. Okay, that's what we are going to do it in these videos to implement the authentication from a MySQL database. Okay, so let me start with that. So as part of that, I'm planning to segregate the JPA based authentication into two videos. In today's video, what we will do is we will completely start from the scratch, like database design. We will create an entity and the repository. We will create a service as well to fetch the roles. Okay, this is a dummy service. Okay, we just want to see whether for a given user ID, are we able to get the respective roles and the user details as well. Okay, that we want to develop as part of this video. In today's video, in the next video, this is the table we are going to create it. Okay, user table will be having user id, username, password, active columns. Role table will be having just role details. User role will be having the role and user id, what all roles will be there, those ids will be stored for each user id. Okay, this is the database we are going to design for this example. In the next video, what we will do is we will remove this service. Okay, this is a dummy service we are going to create in today's video to test whether the roles are coming up fine or not. Okay, but what we will do is we will in the next video, what we will do is we will create a service, the user details service implemented from the user details service. The implementation of it we will create it, and we will give it to the actual security framework. Okay, then that kind of configuration we will do it in the next video. Okay, so for now, for today's video, we will start with the database design. Okay, so let me open my MySQL workbench and go to, yeah, this is my database and this is my Java is my database name, and these are the list of tables. I'm already having it. I'm going to create a new table called user. Okay, so user table will be having couple of columns. uh, User id, I want to maintain it as primary key and also an auto increment. Okay, next I'm going to create another column, user underscore name, and it will be, okay, not required any permissions. And what is that password also I want to store it. Okay, next, whether the user is active or not, that also I want to store it. I want to store it as a boolean type. Okay, or else let us take this tiny int. It will just store, yeah, let me take this. Okay, that's all. Okay, let me remove this. Okay, this user table will be going to have user id as a primary key, username, password, and the active, whether the user is active or not. Okay, that's all. The table is created. Now I'm going to create another table, which is roles table. Okay, I'll name it as role, and this will be having only role id and name. That's it. Again, role id I want to maintain it as auto increment. Here role name, role underscore name. Yeah, that's all. Okay, nothing else will be in this table. Now let me create another table, which is actually a relation between users and roles tables. So there will be three columns, which is one of which is the primary key. User role id is the primary key, and also auto increment. And I want to maintain how many, what is the user ID. We are going to maintain the roles. This is not the primary key, but not null. Okay, and role ID, what is the role the user is having. Okay, so that's all. Here, what we have to maintain some foreign key relationship with the users and roles. This user ID should be in sync with the user ID that is there in the user table. Role ID should be in sync with what is there in the role table. So let me create some foreign keys now. Okay, let me go to foreign keys. Here, uh, user id underscore users table, this is my foreign key name, and the reference table is user. Here I am going to maintain user id. The reference column is users table user ID. This is the relationship. Do not have any compatible type. Okay, I have to change something here. Here in the user table, I have to have it as, okay, here it is int only user ID. Okay, I have to give it a user ID. The selected columns do not have compatible types. Source column, okay. Okay, let me create the indexes first, then we will see. Okay, user ID is having some index. Similarly, I will create role ID as well in this table, index for role ID as well. Role ID underscore role. This is also an index. Okay, here role ID, right? Role ID I want to maintain as role ID. Okay, now let me go to foreign keys and let me go here. Here we should be selecting user ID. Okay, the selected columns do not have compatible types. Source column has type varchar of 45, column user ID of reference table is int. Okay, what is the column type I have selected? Yeah, this is the problem here. Let me take int only here as well. Now let me go there and select the reference column as user ID because I want to maintain the relation between user and user roles table, right? Again, role ID, I want to maintain the relationship between role table and user role table, right? So role ID, again there is a problem. Yeah, so this role ID also I have to maintain it as int. Okay, now let me go to foreign keys. Yeah, here I have to modify this to role ID. Okay, this is fine. Yep, all three tables are created now successfully. Now what we will do is we will enter some data into these three tables. Okay, so user ID will be automatically added. What I'll add is user1 as the username. Password is password, plain password. I'm storing just for testing purpose. Active means one means active. Okay, that is how we will treat it. Okay, admin1, password is password, active is 1. Okay, this is how we are creating the users now. Okay, now let me go to role table and add some roles here. One, user is the role. Two, admin is the role. Okay, now what we have to do in the user role table, we have to give the roles to users here. What is the user ID? See, for user1 I want to give the role as only the user. Okay, so user1 is the user. I want to give the role ID of user role. Okay, similarly for admin user, which is the user ID 2, I want to give the role ID as 2 because it's the role of admin, role ID of admin user. Okay, so this way user role is having all the necessary association between the users and roles. So that's all. We are done with the database design part for storing the users and their respective roles in the MySQL database. Okay, now what we will do is we will go ahead out to our example project. Here what we will do is we will create a table, we will create an entity first, okay, to capture the data from the user table and the user roles table everywhere. Okay, now before to that, let me close all from here. Okay, now let me go there. Here let me create a class as user. Okay, so in this user table, what we will do is we will annotate this as at entity, because this is going to talk to, this is going to be related to MySQL database tables, right? So here entity is not being coming up because we have not added any JPA related dependencies to this project. We are having currently only the web and security. So let me go to the dependencies section and let me add JPA dependency. JPA. Okay, since it's not finding it, let me go to the XML version and copy and modify it. Here, Spring Boot framework, Spring Boot starter, data JPA, right? Similarly, we also have to have MySQL driver as well, right? For this Spring framework, what is the group ID? Group ID we have to give it as MySQL, and we have to give the artifact name. This is the MySQL driver, right? So MySQL connector hyphen Java, and version also let us specify it as runtime. Okay, so we are done with the dependencies. Now let me go here and search whether entity. Yeah, now we are getting the entity. Okay, so this user table, right? This user entity, we have to maintain the relationship with the user table as well, right? So what is there? The ID column is there. Okay, we have to annotate this with that ID, and this is an auto generated column, right? So, and also the column name what we have given in the database table for users, this is the user ID, right? So let's maintain as column name as name is equal to user underscore ID, and this is also an auto increment column, right? So at the date generated value, yeah, here we have to maintain how the value will be generated, or how the value will be generated using the identity technique. Yeah, so that is how we configure the ID column. ID, now we have another column, right? What is that? Username. Yep, so for username, okay, private int user username, right? We also have not int, right? This is string. Password also there in this table, and we also have whether the user is active or not. This we are getting it as boolean. Hmm? Okay, now So we got all the user table data, but we also want the roles that are associated with the given users as a list of roles. So private list of role should be there. So we want to achieve this one now, right? We want to get the list of roles for the given user ID as well. So we have the roles table. We have the user role table as well, right? So now we have to make an association between the users and roles using the user role table. That configuration we have to maintain it here. Okay, similar like this, right? So many roles will be there for a single person, right? One user can be having multiple roles, and also many users can be having many roles, right? In the user role table. So that's what I'm trying to configure here using many to many annotation. Okay, so many to many, many to many. For many to many, we have to fetch all the roles of the given user ID eagerly. So that we have to maintain, that we have to mention here using fetch type. Before to that, we have to maintain the cascade as well. Cascade type dot all. After that, fetch type we have to mention fetch type dot eager fetch. Okay. Once the many to many is defined, configured for this one, we have to mention the join table as well. Okay. What is the join table according to our database design? The join table is user role, right? That is the one which is having all the association between the users and roles. So while you mention the name, we have to mention join columns and also inverse join columns, right? So join column is actually we have to mention like this, right? User ID in this table, in the user role table, will be equal to the user ID in the users table. That's how we have to mention. So in the join columns, we have to mention at join column of name is equal to user ID in this table will be reference. Okay, the reference reference column reference column name is equal to again user ID. Okay, name is equal to user ID. We don't have to mention like this. Yeah, the user ID we have to put it in the braces. Okay, so this is how we mention the join columns. Now we have to mention the inverse join column as well. Inverse join columns. Inverse join columns. What is this inverse join columns? Inverse join column, we have to again mention join column name is equal to role ID, and this role ID will be referred from this roles table. Okay, from this role table what we have created again already. So reference column name, okay, reference column name is equal to role ID. Okay, reference column name. I have to close the role ID here. What is the problem here? Referenced column. Reference referenced column name here. Okay, that's all. That is the configuration. So the join table is the user role, and user ID in this table will be referred with the user ID in the users table. Role ID in the role table will be referred with the role ID in the user role table. Okay. Now, along with the user table, we also have the role entity for the role table. Okay, let me create it. Class name as role. Again, this is also an entity, right? And this is having only two columns, private int. What is that column name we have in the role table? Role underscore ID, right? Role underscore ID. Or you can mention ID and you can mention the column name. Okay, at the date ID, at the date column name is equal to role underscore ID in the role table, and this is also auto generated, right? Generated value. We have to mention the strategy. Strategy is equal to, we have to mention the identity as the strategy. Okay. What is the other column we have? We have the other column as role name, role underscore name. Okay. We mention like this. And that's all. Okay, let's add the constructors and the getter setters for this entity. Generate constructor using superclass. Generate constructor using fields. Generate constructor using getters. Generate getters and setters. Sorry. Okay. So we are done with the role. Now let me import the list as well from here. So we have created the user entity, and again let's generate the getters and setters and the constructor as well for the user table, user entity. Generate getters and setters for all variables. Okay. Now we got the data. I mean, we have created the entities for user and role tables, and user table is having an association with the user role table as well with this join table configuration. Now let's go ahead and create a repository. Okay, which is an interface. Okay, which is I'm going to create user repository. So this interface will be extended from JPA repository, right? So this will be with the table user, and its type is integer. ID column type is integer. Okay, I'll annotate this with the at repository. Okay, now what I'll do is what we are going to get, we are going to get the username from the client. right, for the logged in user. So we have to find the users by username only for doing the authentication, right? So that's all. And this has to return user table entry, okay, user entity basically. So when it returns the user entity based on this configuration, it will always be having id, username, password active, and the list of roles as well. Based on this configuration, it goes and fetches the roles from the role table. Okay, so that's all about the user repository. Now what I'll do is I'll go ahead and create a service, okay, to connect to this uh, user repository. Okay, user service, and I'll annotate this with that service. Okay, okay. Now public, what is the method we have to return? We have to return the user details, right? So fetch user. This is a dummy service. While implementing the security in the next example, we are not going to use it. But in this example, we want to see whether uh, user details and the respective roles are being picked up fine properly or not. So here we have to return some user entity, and that user entity we have to get it from the user repository, right? So user repository, we have to auto-wire it here. We have to call find by username, and username we have to pass what we get from the client. Now let me go ahead here in this employee service itself, right? Okay, instead of employee service touching up or modifying employee service, let me create user controller, because in the employee controller we all are having all related to employee, right? So let me not have this in the employee controller. Instead, I'm creating this in the user controller that go and checks the data from the user table. Okay, request mapping also I have to mention slash user. Here public user find user details. Okay, I'm going to get string username, and this will be request param, which is a query param username. Here I have to mention the request mapping or the get mapping. Okay, get mapping slash slow localhost 8080 slash user slash will come to this method. Again, I have to auto wire the user service here, right? Once I have the user service, I have to call the user service dot find fetch user. Fetch user, whatever return from the service, I will have to return it. Okay, so that's all. But before implementing this, invoking this service, I have to do something. Okay, what I have to do is I have to go to pom.xml. Here it is showing some error. Missing artifact MySQL colon MySQL connector Java hyphen jar at runtime. Okay, what happened to my pom.xml scope? I have to mention, not the version, right? Also, for some time, I want to disable the security because I want to invoke that user details directly without security. Once that is fine, then I'll invoke it again, enable it again. Okay, now let me, okay, there is some problem still in the enable web security. What is the problem? Okay, let me update the project. Okay, I got this. there is a problem because we have commented the security, right? Okay, for that what I'll do is I'll go to the properties and I'll take that file and I'll put it outside of the project, this one, right? I'll delete it from here and I'll put it here. Let me refresh it. Now there are no errors, right? Okay, now let me run it. There is a problem because we have not mentioned any database configuration, right? Where we have to mention the database configuration in the application properties file. Let me comment this. Let me add the database configuration. Spring dot data source dot URL. What is the URL? JDBC colon MySQL colon / localhost colon 3306/Java. Okay. What is the other one? Data source dot username. Java user is the username. Data source dot password. What is the password? Admin123. Data source. Okay, that's all. Okay, let me show the SQL as well. Okay, show hyphen SQL is equal to true. Let me enable the debugging as well. Logging dot level dot org spring framework beans dot factory is equal to debug. Okay, that's okay. This is not required, but this is the database configuration which we have to do it. Okay, now let me restart the application. So application is started up fine. Now let me take the postman. So what is my microservice endpoint URL? My microservice endpoint URL is user controller, right? Slash user slash, and I have to pass the username. So slash user slash. Okay, I have to pass the username as user1. See this. If you invoke the URL as username is equal to user1, we are getting the data from the database. User1, password, active. Roles, we are getting all the columns from the role table. ID is equal to 1, role name is user. Suppose if I pass admin 1, right? Admin user roles are coming up. So role ID is there, role name is admin. Okay, role user details admin1 password. Okay, so that's all. So we are able to successfully get the user details and the roles by just passing the username. That's what we wanted to cover in today's video. So we have designed a microservice as well to get we have developed a microservice to get the roles as well. So that's all we wanted to discuss in today's video. We wanted to see in the next video. What we will do is we will take this repository, okay, and give this repository data to a service that is implemented from the user details service, because for the security framework we have to give the implementation class of the user details service. That service we will connect to the repository, this repository connect to the entities user, and this will connect to the database and gets the data. Okay, this will refer to the database tables. That's all for today. Thank you for watching. We will